November 8, 1950, near the Yalu River, North Korea. Major James Jabara watches a MiG-15 jet fighter scream past his cockpit at 670 miles per hour, its swept wings and silver fuselage representing everything his F-51 Mustang is not. Modern, fast, and designed for the jet age, Jabara's sitting in a propeller-driven fighter that first flew in 1940, a relic from a war that ended 5 years ago, now expected to face Soviet jets that can fly 200 miles per hour faster, climb twice as high, and turn inside anything with a propeller. His squadron mates call the Mustang the spam can because that's what it'll become when a MiG's 37mm cannon hits it. The Air Force brass already wrote off propeller fighters as obsolete, useful only for ground attack missions where speed doesn't matter. Everyone knows jets own the sky now. Everyone knows a Mustang facing a MiG is a death sentence. In the next 90 seconds, Jabara is going to prove that 150 years of aviation assumptions about speed equaling victory are catastrophically wrong, and that the pilot matters more than the machine in ways that will redefine air combat for the next 7 decades. The Korean War caught the United States Air Force in the middle of an identity crisis. In June 1950, when North Korean forces poured across the 38th parallel, the Air Force was transitioning from propeller-driven aircraft to jets, caught between two technological eras with inadequate numbers of both. The problem wasn't lack of jets. The Air Force had plenty of F-80 Shooting Stars, America's first operational jet fighter, and small numbers of the newer F-84 Thunderjets. The problem was that these early American jets were designed for a war that never happened, the hypothetical conflict with the Soviet Union over Western Europe, where they'd fight from established airfields with robust logistics chains and ample fuel supplies. Korea had none of that infrastructure. The peninsula's primitive airfields, most of them dirt or pierced steel planking, couldn't handle the heavier jet aircraft reliably. Jets required enormous amounts of fuel that had to be shipped across the Pacific to ports that barely functioned, then trucked over roads that were being destroyed by the same North Korean forces. The Air Force was trying to stop an F-80. Shooting Star consumed fuel so rapidly that its combat radius, the distance it could fly from base, fight, and return, was barely 100 miles. In a country where the front lines moved 50 miles in a day and targets appeared 200 miles north of friendly airfields, that radius was useless. The Mustang solved these problems through sheer obsolescence. Designed in 1940 as a long-range escort fighter, the P-51, redesignated F-51 in 1948, could fly 1,000 miles on internal fuel, loiter over the battlefield for an hour, and still have reserves to return to base. It operated from any flat surface longer than 2,000 feet. Its Packard-built Merlin engine, a license-produced copy of the British Rolls-Royce design, ran on lower-grade fuel than jets required and could be maintained by mechanics with basic tools. When the Korean War started, the Air Force had over 800 F-51s in reserve storage or serving with Air National Guard units. They were obsolete, but they were available, and availability matters more than capability when you need aircraft immediately. By August 1950, F-51 squadrons were flying combat missions over Korea, mostly ground attack, strafing North Korean convoys, bombing supply depots, and providing close air support to infantry. The Mustang excelled at these missions. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns and ability to carry 2,000 pounds of bombs or rockets made it a devastating ground attack platform. Pilots could see targets clearly from the Mustang's bubble canopy, line up attack runs visually, and make multiple passes because the aircraft's relatively slow speed, 440 miles per hour maximum, allowed time to identify targets that jet pilots would overshoot. But air-to-air combat, that was never supposed to happen. North Korean forces had minimal air capability in summer 1950, mostly Soviet-supplied Yak-9 piston fighters and Ilton ground attack aircraft. The Mustang could handle those threats easily. The calculus changed completely in November 1950 when MiG-15 jet fighters appeared over North Korea, flown by Soviet and Chinese pilots, and suddenly American propeller fighters were facing aircraft from an entirely different technological generation. The MiG-15 represented Soviet design philosophy at its most effective, simple, rugged, and optimized for a single mission, destroying American bombers. The swept-wing jet could reach 670 miles per hour, climb to 50,000 feet, and mounted devastating armament, two 23mm cannons and one 37mm cannon that could destroy a bomber with a single burst. Against the B-29 superfortresses conducting bombing raids over North Korea, the MiG-15 was a revelation, fast enough to intercept, maneuverable enough to evade escort fighters, and heavily armed enough to kill bombers that had seemed invulnerable in World War II. American F-80 jets struggled against MiGs. The F-80 was slower, 580 miles per hour maximum versus 670 for the MiG, climbed poorly above 30,000 feet, and suffered from limited ammunition, just 1,800 rounds across 6.50 caliber guns that lasted roughly 18 seconds of sustained fire. MiG pilots quickly learned to engage F-80s at high altitude where the American jets couldn't perform effectively, then dive away if the engagement turned unfavorable, exploiting their speed advantage to escape. F-51. Mustangs weren't even supposed to encounter MiGs. Air Force doctrine assumed propeller fighters would stay below 15,000 feet, operating in the low-altitude ground attack role while jets handled air superiority missions at medium and high altitudes. The two aircraft types would theoretically never meet because they'd be fighting different wars in different parts of the sky. That assumption lasted until MiG pilots figured out that American fighter bombers, both F-51s and jets, were vulnerable during their attack runs when they were focused on ground targets and flying predictably. MiGs started bouncing strike packages, diving from altitude to catch American aircraft at their most vulnerable. November 1950 brought the first MiG versus Mustang engagements, and the results seemed to confirm every prediction about obsolete propeller fighters facing modern jets. On November 1st, a flight of 4 F-51s was jumped by two MiG-15s near Sinwiju. The MiGs dove from 30,000 feet, made one firing pass at speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, destroyed one Mustang and damaged another, then climbed back to altitude before the American pilots could even react. The entire engagement lasted maybe 10 seconds. The surviving Mustang pilots reported feeling helpless, watching the MiGs appear from nowhere, seeing their wingmen explode, then watching the MiGs disappear back into the sky before they could bring their guns to bear. Intelligence reports from these early engagements painted a grim picture. MiG-15s had a 200+ miles per hour speed advantage over Mustangs at all altitudes. They could dive faster, climb faster, and accelerate faster. Their cannons had roughly double the effective range of the Mustang's .50 caliber machine guns. They could engage from altitudes where Mustangs couldn't reach them. The performance envelope comparison looked like an execution notice for propeller fighters. Air Force planners began calculating how quickly they could withdraw 51s from combat operations and replace them entirely with jets, even inadequate jets, because anything was better than sending pilots into combat in aircraft that couldn't possibly win. Major James Jabara didn't accept that mathematics. A 27-year-old from Wichita, Kansas, Jabara had flown P-51 Mustangs in Europe during World War II, completing 108 combat missions and scoring no victories. He wasn't an ace, wasn't even particularly distinguished, just a competent pilot who'd survived a full combat tour through skill and caution. After the war, he'd transitioned to jets, flying F-80s, but in October 1950, he volunteered to transfer back to F-51s because that's where the Air Force needed pilots immediately. His squadron mates thought he was insane, voluntarily giving up a jet assignment to fly obsolete propeller fighters against MiG-15. Jabara's reasoning was simple and revealed something about his understanding of air combat that most pilots missed. The aircraft's performance mattered less than the tactical situation. MiGs were faster in straight lines, but air combat wasn't drag racing. It was three-dimensional chess played at 400 miles per hour, where positioning, situational awareness, and exploitation of enemy mistakes mattered more than top speed or rate of climb. Jabara had studied every intelligence report on MiG-15 tactics. He'd interviewed pilots who'd survived MiG encounters. He'd analyzed gun camera footage from F-80 engagements. He identified a pattern. MiG pilots were aggressive but predictable. They'd dive from altitude, make one high-speed firing pass, then zoom climb back to safety. That tactic worked brilliantly against aircraft that couldn't maneuver during the attack, like bombers or fighter bombers focused on ground targets, but it had a critical vulnerability. During that high-speed dive, the MiG pilot had limited maneuverability. The swept wings that made the MiG fast at high altitude became liabilities at low altitude and high speed, where airflow over the wings approached compressibility problems that made the aircraft sluggish and unresponsive. More importantly, MiG pilots seemed to assume American pilots would try to run or evade when bounced. The doctrine said to brake hard, try to spoil the MiG's gun solution, then dive for the ground and run at maximum speed. That's what F-80 pilots did, and it sometimes worked. You'd survive, but the MiG would escape. Jabara realized that if he did the opposite, if he turned into the attacking MiG instead of away, the tactical geometry changed completely. The MiG would overshoot, unable to slow down quickly enough to stay behind a slower-moving target that was actively maneuvering toward the attack. And in that moment when the MiG shot past, a brief window measured in seconds, the Mustang would have a firing opportunity that shouldn't theoretically exist. The physics seemed impossible. How could a 440 miles per hour aircraft outturn a 670 miles per hour jet? The answer was in the difference between indicated airspeed and true airspeed, and in the aerodynamic properties of straight versus swept wings. The MiG-15's swept wings were designed for high-speed flight, where they reduced drag and delayed compressibility effects. But swept wings generated less lift at low speeds and high angles of attack compared to straight wings. The Mustang's straight wings, designed in 1940, were optimized for turning performance at moderate speeds. At 300 miles per hour indicated airspeed, a Mustang could sustain a 4G turn indefinitely. A MiG-15 at 300 miles per hour indicated was approaching its stall speed and could barely maneuver without falling out of the sky. The critical insight was that during a diving attack, the MiG would be carrying tremendous energy, kinetic energy from its high speed, that had to be dissipated before it could maneuver effectively. Energy management, the balance between speed and altitude, was fundamental to all air combat, but jet pilots hadn't yet fully internalized how different energy states affected their aircraft. MiG pilots thought in terms of speed advantage. I'm faster, therefore I win. Jabara understood energy states. You're faster right now, but that speed is a liability if I can force you into a maneuvering fight at an airspeed where your aircraft doesn't perform well. On November 8, 1950, Jabara was leading a flight of 4 F-51s on a ground attack mission near the Yalu River. They'd just finished strafing a convoy when his wingman called out MiGs, 2 of them, diving from 25,000 feet in a classic bounce attack standard doctrine, said to jettison external stores, push the throttle forward, and dive for the deck. Jabara did none of those things. He ordered his flight to maintain formation, then turned directly toward the diving MiGs. His wingman, Lieutenant Bob Smith, later said he thought Jabara had lost his mind. You don't turn toward a MiG-15 diving at 600+ miles per hour with cannons that can hit you from 800 meters away. You run, you survive. You don't try to dogfight a jet in a propeller plane. But Jabara's voice on the radio was calm, almost casual. Stay with me. When I brake, you brake. Trust the geometry. The lead MiG's pilot must have been stunned when the Mustangs turned toward him instead of fleeing. His firing solution, calculated for targets running away, was suddenly wrong. He fired anyway, a long burst that passed behind Jabara's aircraft because the closure rate was now much higher than expected. The MiG screamed past Jabara's canopy maybe 200 feet away, close enough that Jabara could see the red star on the fuselage, the pilot's helmet in the cockpit. Then came the critical moment. The MiG pilot, having missed his shot, needed to zoom climb back to altitude for another attack. Standard tactic. He pulled the nose up, converting his excessive speed back into altitude. But he'd made his pass at too low an altitude, maybe 8,000 feet, because he'd been so focused on the surprising target behavior. His zoom climb meant he was now in front of Jabara, relatively slow, climbing predictably. Jabara pulled his Mustang's nose up, following the MiG's climb. The Mustang couldn't match the MiG's climb rate, but it didn't need to. Jabara wasn't trying to follow the MiG to altitude. He was calculating a lead pursuit curve, pointing his nose ahead of the MiG's current position to where the MiG would be in 3 seconds. The Mustang's 6.50 caliber machine guns had a maximum effective range of about 400 yards. The MiG was at maybe 500 yards, climbing away, technically out of range. Jabara fired anyway. 50 rounds, a short burst, more a prayer than calculated gunnery. The ballistic arc of .50 caliber bullets at that range and angle was extreme. The rounds would drop significantly, lose velocity, and most would miss. Jabara was counting on volume and luck. He got both. 3 rounds hit the MiG's left wing root, penetrating the thin aluminum skin and hitting something critical, probably a fuel line or hydraulic system. The MiG didn't explode. It simply started trailing smoke, the pilot aborting his climb and turning northeast toward Chinese airspace. Jabara followed. His flight followed. The wounded MiG was still faster than the Mustangs, but not by much, and the damage was forcing the pilot to fly more carefully, unable to pull high G maneuvers that might worsen the internal damage. They chased the MiG for 40 miles, maintaining visual contact as it descended slowly, leaking more smoke. Near the Yalu River, the MiG pilot ejected, his parachute deploying as the aircraft continued northeast and crashed somewhere in China. The kill was confirmed by all 4 Mustang pilots and by radar operators tracking the engagement. Major James Jabara had just achieved something Air Force planners said was impossible. A propeller fighter had defeated a jet fighter in air-to-air combat. Not by luck, not by surprise, but through superior tactics that exploited the jet's vulnerabilities instead of conceding its strengths. The victory earned Jabara exactly 0 recognition in official channels initially, because acknowledging that F-51s could fight MiGs meant re-examining assumptions about jet superiority and obsolete aircraft that the Air Force had committed to institutionally. But word spread through the pilot community instantly. By November 10th, every F-51 squadron in Korea knew that Jabara had killed a MiG. The story grew with each retelling, which is what happens with these things, but the core facts remained. A Mustang pilot had turned into a diving MiG, forced an overshoot, and scored a kill during the zoom climb. The tactic had a name within 48 hours. The Jabara Break turn toward the threat, force the overshoot, shoot during the zoom climb recovery. It violated every instinct about running from superior aircraft, but it worked. Other pilots started trying it. Some died because turning toward a diving MiG requires perfect timing and a pilot who can judge closure rates intuitively. Too early and the MiG adjusts its dive, kills you easily. Too late and the MiG's first burst hits you before you complete the turn. The timing window was maybe 1 second, requiring the kind of combat instinct that can't be taught, only developed through survival. But some pilots had that instinct or developed it quickly. By late November, F-51 squadrons were recording MiG kills weekly, not frequently, maybe 1 kill for every 20 encounters, but frequently enough to prove Jabara's victory wasn't a fluke. The Air Force's response was institutional confusion. On one hand, they had empirical evidence that F-51s could engage MiG-15s successfully under specific tactical conditions. On the other hand, admitting that publicly meant explaining why they'd been planning to withdraw F-51s from service because they were too obsolete to face modern jets. The compromise was bureaucratic. F-51s would continue flying ground attack missions primarily, but pilots were authorized to engage MiGs if attacked, using tactics developed from Jabara's engagement. This guidance essentially told pilots, "We don't officially believe you can win, but if you try and succeed, we'll take credit." Jabara himself transitioned back to jets in early 1951, checking out in the new F-86 Sabre that was finally arriving in Korea in significant numbers. The F-86 was America's answer to the MiG-15, a swept-wing jet with comparable performance and better pilot visibility. Jabara would go on to become the first American jet ace, scoring 15 confirmed kills in F-86, and his tactics developed in the F-51 translated directly to jet combat. The fundamentals didn't change: force the enemy into energy states where your aircraft performs better than theirs, exploit their predictable tactics, and make them fight your fight instead of their fight. But the lessons from November 8, 1950 extended far beyond Jabara's personal success. The engagement proved that speed wasn't everything in air combat, that maneuverability at critical energy states mattered more than maximum velocity, and that pilot skill and tactical awareness could overcome significant performance deficits. These weren't new lessons. World War I aces understood them, but the jet age had created an assumption that raw performance would dominate, that the faster, higher-flying aircraft would always win. Jabara's Mustang killing a MiG shattered that assumption and forced a reevaluation of what made an effective fighter aircraft. The MiG kill also revealed uncomfortable truths about Soviet jet tactics. The diving attack and zoom climb were effective against bombers but predictable against maneuvering fighters. Soviet pilots were trained to maximize their aircraft's strengths, speed, and altitude, but weren't prepared for opponents who refused to cooperate with that game plan. American pilots started calling MiG-15 fighters one-pass then haul-ass fighters because that's what they did reliably. The tactic worked often enough that Soviet pilots kept using it, but it created exploitable patterns for any American pilot willing to turn toward the threat instead of away. Korean War air combat evolved rapidly through 1951 and 1952 as F-86. Sabres replaced older jets, and remaining F-51s shifted entirely to ground attack roles. The Sabre versus MiG. 15 battles became legendary, with Americans claiming roughly 10-to-1 kill ratios, numbers that historians still debate but which reflected genuine tactical and training advantages. American pilots trained extensively in dissimilar air combat, practicing against aircraft with different performance characteristics. Soviet pilots trained to execute specific attack profiles that worked until they didn't. The F-51's combat career in Korea ended officially in January 1953 when the last Mustang squadrons transitioned to jets. By then, F-51s had flown over 62,000 combat sorties, destroyed hundreds of ground targets, and scored 17 confirmed air-to-air kills, 11 of those against jet aircraft. The air-to-air record was absurdly lopsided: 351 F-51s lost to all causes versus 17 aerial victories, but the kills themselves were never about statistics. They were about proving that obsolete didn't mean helpless, that clever tactics could overcome material disadvantages, and that the aircraft was only as good as the pilot flying it. Jabara's specific engagement remained classified until 1954, when the Air Force finally acknowledged publicly that propeller fighters had successfully engaged jets in Korea. The delay reflected bureaucratic embarrassment more than security concerns. The Air Force had spent the late 1940s selling Congress and the public on the necessity of transitioning entirely to jets, arguing that propeller aircraft were obsolete relics with no place in modern warfare. Having to admit that those relics had killed jets they'd said were invincible created messaging problems. The technical analysis of how a Mustang killed a MiG eventually became standard curriculum at fighter weapons schools. The engagement demonstrated energy management principles that applied to all air combat, regardless of aircraft. Type speed is energy. Altitude is energy. You can trade one for the other, but the exchange rate depends on your aircraft's characteristics. In a turning fight at low altitude, the Mustang's straight wings gave it better energy retention than the MiG's swept wings. That advantage lasted only in a narrow performance envelope. Below 350 miles per hour indicated airspeed, but that envelope was exactly where the Jabara Break forced the engagement. Modern air combat has largely moved beyond guns-only dogfighting. Missiles engage at ranges measured in tens of miles. Radar and avionics dominate targeting. The physical aircraft's maneuverability matters less when you can shoot at enemies you never see visually. But the fundamental principle Jabara proved remains: understanding your opponent's limitations is more valuable than maximizing your strengths. Every air-to-air tactic developed since Korea incorporates that logic. You force the enemy into situations where their advantages don't apply and your advantages, whatever they are, dominate. The F-51 Mustang's reputation transformed because of engagements like Jabara's. Before Korea, it was remembered as a World War II escort fighter, good but not exceptional. After Korea, it became the aircraft that refused to die, that kept performing missions. Jets couldn't handle, that proved propeller fighters weren't obsolete, just outclassed in specific circumstances. The Mustang continued serving in reserve and foreign air forces through the 1980s, flying counterinsurgency and ground attack missions where its long loiter time and ease of maintenance outweighed any performance disadvantages. Several F-51s remain airworthy today, flying at air shows where they still draw crowds. The distinctive sound of the Merlin engine, that deep, throaty roar that no jet has ever replicated, reminds audiences of an era when pilots fought closer to the edge of their aircraft's performance envelope, when combat was visual and personal, when you could see the enemy pilot's face as you fought. Modern fighter pilots in F-35 still study Jabara's engagement, not for the specific tactics, which are obsolete, but for the mindset. Your limitations don't define your options unless you accept them as absolute. Major James Jabara retired from the Air Force in 1966 as a colonel, having flown combat missions in 3 wars, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He died in 1966 in a car accident in Florida, age 43, far too young but having lived more intensely than most people manage. In twice the years his Medal of Honor citation mentioned his jet kills in Korea. It didn't mention November 8, 1950, specifically because that engagement remained officially classified when he received the medal. But every fighter pilot who knew the story understood that Jabara's most important victory wasn't his 15th kill. That made him an ace. It was his first MiG kill in a propeller plane that proved speed isn't everything. The toy plane that squadron mates mocked as a death trap ended its combat career, having written a chapter in the air warfare that jets haven't erased. Sometimes the old ways work, not because they're better, but because they're unexpected. Sometimes turning toward the threat instead of running is the only tactic that works. And sometimes the pilot matters more than the machine, proving that human judgment, tactical creativity, and sheer audacity can overcome any performance deficit the engineers say is insurmountable. 7 decades later, that lesson remains as relevant as it was the day a Mustang killed a MiG and rewrote the rules about obsolete aircraft. So the next time someone tells you that you're too old, too slow, or too outdated to compete, remember Major James Jabara and his toy plane Mustang. Sometimes being underestimated is the greatest tactical advantage you can have. If you enjoyed watching a World War II propeller plane embarrass a Soviet jet, hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories of underdogs, misfits, and obsolete warriors who rewrote the rulebook when everyone said they couldn't win. Now here's your challenge for the comments. If you could take any outdated weapon or vehicle from history and drop it into a modern conflict, what would you choose and why? Would you bring a P-51 Mustang to fight modern jets, a sword to a gunfight, a carrier pigeon to hack a computer network? Give me your most creative, most absurd, or most genius answer bonus points if you can explain how your ancient weapon would actually win against modern technology. Drop your answers below, and may the most ridiculous yet somehow logical response win bragging rights. Thanks for watching, and remember, it's not about the speed of your aircraft, it's about the speed of your thinking.